in this session, Brian and I are going to take a look at what we're doing from a global perspective, not from the perspective of individual local and regional projects, but from a global perspective. And there's a little bit of history, and there are two parts to our proposal. It's not a proposal, it's something that is happening in the world. Last year at the Geo Design Summit, as is normal at the Geo Design Summit, Jack Dangermond, who makes the introduction, and he'll do that Tuesday morning, he also has a discussion at the end with the people in the audience. And there's usually 200, 220, something like that people. The place is pretty well full. And at the end of last year, he raised the question of dealing with the whole globe as a design problem. And he asked, is that possible? And he turned to me. We have this relationship, sort of. He turned to me and said, what do you think, sort of? And I said, I think that's absolutely feasible. And we talked about it a little bit more. And then the meeting ended, and then Brian and Tom and I had a series of emails, and we wrote a proposal. We wrote a 2-page proposal with a budget of how would you go about doing a global geodesign problem within the structure that we have been working toward in the collaboration. And that proposal had a budget, a very big budget. Not a very, very big budget, but a very big budget. And a series of discussions were held, and it hasn't been funded, has not been funded. But it's gotten interest, and it's gotten interest as an idea along with other ideas that are abroad in the land. One of the ideas that's abroad in the land is built upon the acceptance of most of the countries of the world of the SDGs, of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the difficulties that we have had are reflected in everybody else's definitional issues and analytical issues also. But there's a move to develop the ability based on data and artificial intelligence, which is essentially backwards looking and present looking, to develop a state of the SDGs globally. Right, so imagine that you have global data, which is very obvious that we have very good global data, and that we're modeling systems as specialists. There are climate models, oceanographic models, vegetation change models. And somehow to link those systems and models to an index of some kind framed in the SDGs and be able to report annually the state of SDGs in a somewhat spatial manner. That's being done. It's being done by a group in France. It's being done by several groups, well-funded groups. But the thing about artificial intelligence is it's really based on intelligence. And it's based on data, which means it takes you to the present. And the question is, what do you do about it? What do you do about it if the SDGs are going down? Imagine you have SDG globally for 1900, 1950, and 2000. And now it's 2020. And you saw that the indices in some ways are going up and in some ways are going down. Because it's very clear inside the SDGs that as some go up, others have to go down. All right? This is not a win times 17. It isn't that at all. Think of Jorg's project. Tokyo's housing gets better, Vietnam's water gets worse. That's his project. Right? But if you saw it globally, you'd see those relationships. Well, there are people doing that. That's not us. That's them. But the question is, what do you do about it? How do you move it forward? And that's fundamentally a design problem. So today, in this hour, we want to talk about it from that perspective and how it affects what we're doing, and I'll show you how we fit into that, if we can fit into it. We might not. First of all, size and scale matter. Allow me to say this. Most of you use the word scale when you mean size. And from now on, please, a large geographic area versus a small geographic area is a large size area relative to a small size area. The small size area at the same size map is seen at a larger scale. The global map is seen at a smaller scale. 1 to 10 is a larger scale than 1 to a million because it brings it closer to you at the same size. All right? So, a larger size area is seen differently than a smaller size area. Allow me to say this in another way. Our friends from Cincinnati were looking at soil in small size, large scale. Jorg from Norway was looking at soil in large size, small scale. Okay? That's how the world works. Linguistically, it should. But it's absolutely appropriate. It's absolutely appropriate that the Cincinnati people are looking this way and that they have to deal with different kinds of people. And it's perfectly clear that when you're looking out here, you're not looking at individual people. You're looking at groups of people and people as people. Jorg is not distinguishing the people of Tokyo from Mumbai. He's not distinguishing the people of Tokyo from the people of Mumbai. He's just dealing with people who have houses. But at Cincinnati scale, you better know Mrs. Jones, who owns the land that you want to put your membrane on. All right? So that's actually a very important question because it affects the way we do geodesign. If you look up here, this is how the IGC structure of reporting projects wants you to work. But it actually was designed for this part of the problem. This is the diagram of how Geo Design Hub was designed, with different groups of people, each having their own design and then negotiating. This one works better up here and doesn't work very well down here in Cincinnati. I know that, and you know that. This one doesn't work very well up here because this is long-term big and this is short-term smaller. Cincinnati needs to have a solution tomorrow. Norway needs to have a solution over the next 20 and 30 years. So that leaves us with a really interesting set of problems. This is the size of the projects that we've done in the collaboration. In the first year, we had a move in this direction. We had some really interesting experiments. But most of you are working in here. And what I would like to see at the end of this conversation is, how do we flip this graph? Because there are thousands of people working here, and there are very, very few people working here. And I'd love to see this graph flip. So I've talked to a lot of you at this conference, and I said, why don't you do a bigger project? It's not more difficult than a small project. There's as much work in Cincinnati as there is in Norway. It's a semester's worth of work by a bunch of people. It's only a question of what size you really want to tackle. These ones are familiar. They're in the curriculum. By the way, you can get a job more easily at this skill. Which is not trivial. That's not a trivial consideration. But these are the missing ones. And they're much more important in the long run. From a global perspective, this is where we ought to be going. But going back, the lesson here is this. Up there, it works really, I thought, in my opinion, as an observer and as a doer, this works really well up in here. My projects, the ones I did, are mixed. I've actually mixed them. The London project that's in the book is in here. But Ana Clara Muro from Brazil, in the book, in the last chapter of the book, she writes, in my projects in Brazil, the people can't think 30 years ahead and relate it to innovation. They're thinking about tomorrow morning, and they need to negotiate their immediate needs. So she and I also do a lot of workshops using Geo Design Hub and this structure. And the problem is, do we focus up here, or do we broaden the way of representing our projects so we have formats and templates, which do exist actually, to report projects done this way, or mixed projects also? And that's something that is on the boards. That's on the boards for discussion. We haven't made a decision. But if it was my recommendation, I would broaden the reporting system and let people decide which of many ways they would fulfill the project. However, the thing that unites them is they all can be judged and compared by the SDGs. There's a reason, we talked about it yesterday, warts and all, problems and all, why the SDGs are being used. And that's because the countries of the world have decided they want to try it. It may fail, but it doesn't fail based on one experience by us. It doesn't. It fails because it doesn't work over a 5 to 10 year period. And it doesn't work until something is substituted. So you can complain all you like, as you should, but until you've got a better idea, that's the best idea that we have. And if it is adopted, it remains the question of how do we do it? Now, when Tom and Brian and I decided, and we just did that decision, let's switch to the SDGs, we knew that this would likely to be the dominant system in the world. And we wanted to try it. And some failed and some didn't fail, and it's a mixed group. If you really look, most of the people who did it did not understand it. They had trouble, they had to figure out what to do, and they did some stupid things like changing the template graphically, which makes no difference at all. But we have different ways of it. This is what I think we're going to do. Number one, keep it simple. Number two, deal with direct impacts only, knowing that there are indirect impacts. Because figuring out how you do the indirect ones is not something we require, but we absolutely encourage experimentation on. So next year, every system in which you make a change should be reported in a column, so that when we look at the matrix, we can see which systems you've actually changed. So you don't fill out the whole thing. You fill out only the columns in which you've made a direct change. Secondly, you pick the horizontal SDGs which you think you've influenced. Why that? That's probably a really important change. Because I suspect that if you're working at the small size, you'll be picking different ones than if you're working at the big size. You may be picking fewer ones, because some of these are related directly to people, and some are more directly to the non-people systems. You may not have any water to have water life. And if you're working on an ocean as a design problem, you may not have any land as a land system. So we have to allow flexibility in which systems you fill in. So the way these will look next year is not this way, because our colleagues in Abu Dhabi did in fact use all 10 systems, but they probably shouldn't have dealt with poverty, because they're the richest country in the world. They may get less rich over time, not more rich. But those are the choices that you'll have to make. And you could do that any way you can. And we absolutely encourage those of you who are quantitatively oriented to show us how those links work, but only report the things that are required. Add in a second matrix. And those of you who think that this can be done spatially, maybe the impact is here, but maybe the effect is there. Try making some maps of an index. Show it to us. And if it works and everybody thinks that's great, in the next year we'll do it. But between now and then, we're not going to do it because we can't require it. But it's really clear. You fill in the columns that you've changed, you pick the rows that you've influenced. And I think that will work. It's really important. Just listen to me because it affects me personally. Use the templates. Don't make the maps bigger. Don't use the small print. Don't put color behind your things. The reason these templates look the way they do is because they could go directly into a book from the boxes. They're in the right font. They're in the right size. The graphics are clear enough. There's no nonsense in them. They're not graphic problems. They're information problems. And they make less work for Brian and me. And that's important. And it's really stupid to try to make your own graphic representations. Make more, do whatever you want with your students, but do that as required. Otherwise, it's just work, and it looks foolish among 100 projects when yours is in green or purple in the background. Why? What's the point of that? It's just work for you, and it's work for us. Now, the thing that's really important is that the projects that we've done sit inside massive global changes. And Alan's work with his group on the assumptions are global. And each of those has a map. And there are models behind those maps, and there are data behind those maps. And as I said before, they're being assessed as a means of identifying global indicators of the health of those 17 systems. And the problem is, how do you move it forward into design?
And what we have observed is that through the projects that we've already accomplished with IGC, we're actually covering a fairly large range of the world. So this is the framework for the sort of proposal ideas that we've been putting together. So first of all, we have a global strategy. Global geodesign studies will use available global scale data, consistent assessments. So these were going to be coarse. They're going to be coarse scale. They will use resource allocation models, impacts assessments, and so on that we can find that address global scale problems. So they're going to be related to the diagram that Carl showed you just a couple of minutes ago. They're going to be that kind of coarseness. But they give us information about how different parts of the world interact with each other. At the moment, we have no part of our projects, with the possible exception of Peter's presentation this morning, that is talking about how oceans interact directly with land masses. And we need to have that. The second step is this one, where I will get my handy-dandy tool here. The national level, where we have, within that global system, we have national level problems. They vary in size. Some countries, Russia, United States, are quite large. Some countries, Slovenia, quite small. Nevertheless, there is a possibility of us, through our university network, to establish national level teams that will conduct geodesign studies that nest within and complement the global studies that we're capable of doing. Yeah, replacing vertically. But the key is that through this IGC activity, we have already identified maybe the roadmap towards doing this. And then the third step is the local and regional. And this, I hope you can see the little green dots in each of those. Those are the locations of the projects that we have already accomplished. Some of them are at a larger scale, but many of them are at this small local and regional scale. And within those frameworks, we already have university teams. We have 143 universities we've identified and have been in communication with over these 2 years. And those university teams could be conducting studies using methods that are similar to the ones that we've been using within the IGC already, that then inform the national level studies that then mesh with the global scale studies. So looking at that visually, what we are envisioning as an idea is a visualization-oriented toolkit that allows us to look at projects, and this is, I'm using Slovenia here as the example, and Slovenia, as that second stage down within the globe, Slovenia interacts with Italy, Croatia, surrounding countries, the Adriatic Ocean. So it's not Slovenia alone, it is Slovenia plus its neighbors. It is not Ljubljana alone, but it is Ljubljana and its surrounding communities. And then at the micro scale, at the neighborhood scale, it is neighborhoods within Ljubljana collaborating and interacting with all of the other neighborhoods of Ljubljana. But to be able to adopt that small scale, small time step, small size, I apologize, small size, small time step through large size, large time step framework that Carl talked about just a minute ago, fits very well with the way that we think about the world. So this is what we're thinking of, and this is looking at the 2019 projects in red and the 2020 projects in purple. They already establish a framework. So we would like to invite you and invite your feedback to us about how you could fit into this network. How could you participate in this, and what would be your willingness in doing that? Because this would be a volunteer effort. This is what we've thought about, because we've thought about how would we schedule this, and obviously we cannot do, it doesn't make any sense to do all these 3 steps simultaneously. We need to examine the global studies first to establish what the overall framework would be within which national studies sit, within which local and regional studies sit. So this is a sort of a draft timescale. We actually think we could probably compress it in this way, thinking about a 2-year horizon from now, that we could potentially be sitting in this room talking about a nested set of projects where we're not just looking at projects as separate entities. And that is one of the problems that we have in IGC. We are still self-siloed. We are only talking to ourselves at the moment. We are not talking to the other people doing projects like ours or projects at the same size of ours. But through this kind of network, could we conceive of a way that we could do a set of nesting projects in this way, so that we're able to tackle those global scale projects and the global scale issues. And I think going back, you heard me talk about this yesterday, we're going back to Carl's comments about the SDGs, and many of these global evaluation systems, they are written by policymakers and by governments whose first thought is about laws, economics, important parts of the framework, but each of those, in some way or other, is dependent on land. If we're going to solve poverty, we have to find land for food. there is no new land being produced. We are using it for one thing or another. It's either forest or urban development or food production at the moment. We have to make choices about those land allocations. That's something we do, but it's not something which is an element of the way the SDGs are being thought about at the moment. That is a major contribution that we could make out of these kinds of efforts into that conversation. So, should we open for discussion? Any feedback to us?
I have a couple of thoughts about this. It seems pretty likely that there are not obvious levers that you can pull at the global scale. Possibly something to do with the circulation of winds in the atmosphere, but I don't know how you'd get a handle on that. Rather, most of the levers you can pull are at some other local size and scale, and they tend in their effects to trickle up. So if everybody changes a little bit of carbon sequestration locally, you get a global carbon sequestration that you can measure and impact. So it seems likely that when you say nest within, that can be refined to mean something about contribute to this flow. And mapping the data flows across here is a job itself. When you say size and scale matter, that's because the things that work at one end don't work at the other. The knowledge that we have, the scientific models, the kinds of measurements we make, the resolution of the tools we have are all variable. And that's a big, big problem. I'll leave it at that. The other that I have introduced once in this group and once within the Digital Landscape Architecture group, the National Science Foundation for several years in the US permeated the study of something it calls the biocomplexity spiral, which says exactly that if you want to make a change at the forest level, you can do it at a tropic level down at the individual level or at a level up at the bioregion, and it works both ways. And that's very rich and complicated for the kinds of things we're talking about.
You're right about that. The real missing thing, the real missing thing that we have is not the projects that have obvious clients, people, needs, but the 20 to 30-year studies of something like all of Slovenia, all of Texas, all of the watershed of the Mississippi, all of the things that in the 1930s were standard procedure in the United States, and doing them again. But doing them globally and doing them in a comparable way of at least thinking about them and actually seeing them, understanding them, and thinking about them. And you're right. The thing that we talked about among ourselves globally is to do something that looks like a global design. Nobody pretends it is a global design. But to influence the things that people at the national and local and not national and local, national and watershed level, where laws are made that people have to behave themselves with, get made. Austria is a perfect example. You wouldn't study a neighborhood in Vienna, you would study all of Austria or all of the Alps and make that a unit of study. And those scale studies have been done in the past, but are not being done in universities as collaborative efforts. That's the missing piece. And if those could be goosed in a way, promoted in a way through the exact same countries in the UN that have adopted the SDGs as the way of them getting a future look based on the SDGs, that's a huge contribution.
You know, the slide I appreciated was the one that Brian narrated where we're talking about going across these borders. I think coming from my perspective, the border that I'm least comfortable with is the way in which we've segregated the ocean from the land. Yeah, right? Sure. And really we need to be talking about an estuary scale / watershed estuary social ecological system. Yep. And I think that the one thing I just am just pointing out is just not to let these sort of arbitrary political and continental boundaries be that significant.
Yeah, if I could, I mean, the point we're both making is that the advantage of using these squares, of requiring these squares, is it demands that you look at your neighbors. Because very few real places in the world are squares. Watersheds aren't squares. So that was a deliberate choice on our part right at the beginning. But the other thing that was occurring to me, Gosh, maybe I just, you just got me off track. I'll come back to it, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to reinforce how profound this is. And about 10 years ago, I was in Russia, and I was working on a project with Norman Foster's company, and they had like a 30 or 40 page sketch pack is what we called them back in the day. And it was like a proprietary organization of a document. Shows the benefit of this kind of thinking. And it looked at the position of the site on the globe, and then it established a whole bunch of data points that were at all the different scales. And apart from just figuring things out in an integrated and profound way, in ways that people have never thought about those things, it provides an ability to make convincing arguments that allow the best ideas to win. A very centric way to say that is for me to get my way, but the benevolent way to say it is the best ideas win when you incorporate those different scales. So we were just talking about the idea of in the Wasatch Front, if we had extended ours to the 12 national monuments and national parks that are at either end of the Wasatch Front, it would have created a whole new awareness of a responsibility that this has to feed that system for tourism, for responsible treatment of natural environment, for gateway communities, to national monuments. It just changes the whole perception of things and allows the arguments to win.
Sorry, I just recalled my other thought, which is, this is more on the practical scale of things. One observation we've had is that there's three countries in particular that are missing from our network that are really important in this ocean to land kind of mix. We're missing Indonesia, we're missing Malaysia, and we're missing the Philippines, all of which are massive archipelago countries where that relationship. So if any of you know of any people in those locations that we could bring into this, I think that would help, because Esther is one scale of things, but there are people that are surrounded by and increasingly covered by water in the world that are part of the thinking that we need to bring to this.
Let me follow up again, a conversation from last year. We are weak in Africa. We're absent in North Africa and in the desert countries of Central Africa. We have one inactive person in Russia. We have nobody in the former Soviet Union. We have no active project in Canada. We have one team and one other team, two teams in India. They're all in Mumbai, and one is not active. And we have half the states of the United States, but not the other half. If everybody here talked to somebody in their neighboring state or country, last year we had a conversation about trying to double the numbers. We've gotten another 60%. But there's no reason in the world, there are plenty of projects, for God's sakes. There's no reason to keep this secret. There's no monopoly in the state of Texas. All right? I'm serious. If you had to do a project for your state of the United States without knowing what was across the border of your state, where your stupid governor doesn't let your state data agency go into the neighboring state, as in Georgia, you're missing out on your work. So it's in your interest to trade data with your colleague in South Carolina if you're a faculty member at the state of Georgia. It's in your interest. How could you do a project in Norway without knowing what's in Sweden? At least you have the data. So those things we asked people to do. We wrote an email to every person in the IGC twice saying, find more people. I have no idea who tried, but I sure as hell know where we didn't. We have gross areas that aren't there. Finally, we had 4 teams that were departments of oceanography: Dalhousie, Canterbury, Santa Barbara, and might have been Rhode Island. in the first year. Nobody did a project on the ocean itself as a design problem. You're right about the estuaries, but you can also say, what do you do about fishing? What do you do about habitat? What do you do about mangroves? What do you do about submarines and gas exploration? Those are land uses. We need oceanographics. We need them. And if you know them, get them. We're prepared to help. One more thing. The Brazilians. Ana Clara Muro ran 2 years ago a Geo Design conference in South America. 11 countries were represented. We did a workshop with the faculty, teaching the faculty. I'd love to do a workshop in Kazakhstan. We're prepared to help. She and her colleagues are now teaching other universities in other countries how to work. Why not? Why not? It's much, much better than being parochial and locally focused. Now, some of us are by necessity, and some are by preference. And there's nothing wrong with that, because those local projects are the end game for most people. And if you can't show them the local, that point was made by Rhode Island. That was made by him. That if you can't show the local people how it affects them tomorrow morning, they won't listen to you about 20 years from now. That's a very important point. If we can't show them the Cincinnati project, maybe they won't do the Norway project. So we need those projects. We need them. But there could be hundreds of them in the average school. I mean, all you have to do is to say to every one of your colleagues, at the end of your little tiny corporate park, show us how it affects the SDGs. That's all you have to do.
Okay. My first doctoral advisor is in Malaysia. I can force him to join. So to answer that question. And the other is to make this globally workable. I think we not only just work in our own silos. If there are themes like sea level rise, we need to talk to each other. Although we are named collaboration, group of collaborators, we are not really collaborating on topics. So if we, I'd like to work with the sea level rise people to have a collaborative kind of agreement on how to proceed with this. And the conclusion of that might be something more meaningful than just comparing different products from sea level rise groups.
We are not going to solve that in the next 7 minutes before we go for lunch. But if you look at the schedule, the discussion this afternoon is deliberately focused around this sort of an issue. I mean, we're asking you to create an organizational chart for IGC with the idea of addressing exactly what Mintai just asked. Is now, how would we do it? You've seen the website. You know who the webmaster is. We've got limited sort of communication tools at the moment, but let's design an org chart that might help to address some of these. And if we come out with 3 kind of proposals as to what that is after this afternoon's discussion, that would be a fantastic sort of next step in our evolution.
Another thing triggered by your comment, which is something that in 2015, when we first had a dinner, 10 of us probably sat at, I'm not sure who was at the dinner, but I know I was. And I proposed this. For example, you're at Virginia Tech and Youngmin is at Seoul. You've got a coastal place. Why doesn't Youngmin do a coastal place? And the only difference between yours and his is the housing density. What's similar and what's different? All right? And even Guo Ping, who's working in an estuarian fishing village in Ghana, he can pick one in Virginia and see what's different. There's no reason why you have to work in Texas with Texas. Find somebody who's doing the same size scale, compare across geography, or compare a hot dry with a wet cold climate. There's all kinds of relationships that pay off enormously in the exchange of students, faculty, information. Get out of your box. Have a good lunch.